There are many ways to pray the Scriptures. One is to find the book, open it, and read it. That's the first way to pray them. But to get deeper into the Scriptures, it helps to use our imaginations. And one particular way that I find useful in exploring the Scriptures is to work in my imagination to place myself into the story as one of the characters in a parable or one of the characters in an event where Jesus is. And I often find myself placing myself in the comfortable chair of the parables. So in this parable of the unforgiving slave, I find myself putting myself in the place of the second slave mentioned, the one who owed 100 denarii, 100 days' wages. That's a big amount. 100 days' wages to a fellow slave who had just been forgiven 10,000 talents. Now, it took a couple years to earn a whole talent. So 10,000 talents is a pretty big debt for a slave to owe anybody. But I find myself putting myself into the role of the second slave. It's like, well, why haven't you forgiven me? Why don't you forgive my debt? I'll pay you back. I'll do it. I will. And that's the comfortable chair of this parable. The next most uncomfortable chair, and I believe that's how Jesus wants us to hear his stories, is to work our way from the comfortable spot to the pointy chair, to the uncomfortable one with the spring that's loose in our butt and that makes us like, ooh, yeah, he's talking about me. So I move from being the second slave to being the group of slaves who say, hey, wait a second, you were forgiven. Let's go to the master and tell him about this. So I look around and I see not just the people who haven't forgiven me, the role of the second slave in the story, but I find myself trying to put myself into the role of the group of slaves, the rest of them, saying to the master, hey, didn't you just forgive? Well, then why didn't this person forgive somebody else who needed forgiveness the way you forgave them? And then as I go a little bit deeper into the Scriptures, I find myself in the pointy chair, the hot seat. The slave who was forgiven 10,000 talents worth of debt, just written off. Not yet, we'll work out a payment plan and you can pay me back over the next 10,000 years. You'll pay me back a little bit at a time. You can't die ever because it's going to take you several lifetimes to pay this back, but I'll forgive you. That's the role I believe Jesus wants all who hear this story to place ourselves in, because that's what he comes back to at the very end. We have been forgiven everything we've ever done. Not because we deserve to be forgiven, but because God saw his people broken and wounded and bleeding from sin. And God decided, I will forgive them. And what God asks of us is then, as we have been forgiven, we say that in the prayer that comes up a little bit later on, the Lord's Prayer. As we have been forgiven, let us be forgiving of one another. Now, it is hard for me to be forgiving. It's not like a natural talent that I have that says, sure, let it go, it's fine. I brood. I hold on to stuff. I keep it in the back of my mind and in my gut where it churns around and just does horrible things to me. That's what unforgiveness does for us. It ruins us. It doesn't bother the other people. They could care less, or they're happy that we're not forgiving them. Like, I did it and I'm glad. Okay. That mean I can't forgive you ever? No. God challenges us. Well, God invites us and then challenges us to be forgiving of everyone. To be forgiving of our family, of our friends, of our acquaintances, of the people we know, of the people that we don't know. See? Yeah, it gets better, doesn't it? God invites us to be forgiving as we have been forgiven. Now, When it's hard to forgive and we're challenged to be forgiving, it's like God wants us to fly about the room, but we don't have any wings. So God's asking for us to do the impossible. God wouldn't do that. That's not the God that we hear Jesus describe in the Gospels. So here's how I work my way around that in my little head. When I want to go buy a house, generally, I don't just pull out a check and write it and say, here's the keys, thank you, have a nice day, because I don't have that much. But I know who has a lot of money. The banks. The banks have tons of money. I'll go to a bank and I'll say, buy my house for me. And then every month, I'll pay you back. And sometimes the banks are willing to do that. Sometimes they're not, but sometimes they are. And they'll charge varying amounts of interest depending on where your score is on the little things. But banks are willing to lend out the money, buy the house, let you live in it, and make little bitty payments along the way. So that's how I've worked out in my head forgiveness can be. What's been done to me personally, or what I have seen done to others when I am the second slave or the crowd of slaves, is hard to forgive. But God has forgiven me everything when I'm on the uncomfortable hot seat. So having been forgiven by God of all the sin ever in my life, I can go back to God and say, God, you have all the forgiveness there could ever be in the world. I want you to forgive this person for me in my name as well as you've already done in your own. And then I will pay you back. And my monthly payment is not a monthly payment. It's every time that wrong that was done to me or that sin that of others that I don't work to try and be forgiving of. I have to remember that I have asked God to forgive them for me, and that I'm working now to pay it back by working to be more forgiving every time that memory comes up. It seems to work most of the time. There are still times where the anger, the frustration, the pain of the sin that was done either to me or to others washes over me and I get angry and unforgiving again. But then I've missed a payment, so I got to go back then and work to be more forgiving. That's how this parable of the unforgiving servant seems to make sense to me, moving from the most comfortable position of the one who was wronged and not forgiven, to the crowd that sees it, to the one who's been forgiven 10,000 talents worth of debt. That's me. That's us. We can't be forgiving because we are broken and human and trapped in sin. So we have to go to God who is love, who is forgiveness, and work with God to have that other sin forgiven, not just our own, but the sins that we encounter in the world every day, the sins of injustice, the sins of murder, of rape, of child abuse. Those are really hard things to try and be forgiving of. Yet God is love, and God challenges us to be representatives of God in this world. So we must work to learn how to go to God, that God might help us learn to forgive. Because it's not an easy lesson. It's not one that we're going to get because you heard this sermon and say, oh, I got it now, I'm going to go do this. It'd be nice if we were able to do that and hold on to it. We can hold on to it till we get to the parking lot and someone cuts us off, or we're down at Giant Eagle and something bad happens and whatever. But we're challenged by God to do this every day, every moment, for every wrong done to us or done to others. Because, this is the key point, because God sees us dead in sin, weighed down with no way out. And God chooses to love us and invites us to love one another.